Welcome back. Welcome back. This is the People's Voice. I am Trey Evans and I am the People's Voice. Thank you again for checking out the podcast this week. As always, it is greatly appreciated. As always, we thank everyone who has taken some time out to listen to the podcast today. We do understand that you could be doing something else with your time, so we appreciate you tapping in with us to spend that time listening to the podcast. As always, if the information is valuable and you feel it to be enlightening, we do ask that you subscribe to the podcast. That way you'll be notified when each episode is released. We put out a new episode every Friday. Now, the times that it comes out, it varies, and it's not me. It's, once the distributor releases it, but it does come out on Friday. So that's why you should sign up and subscribe. That way you'll get the notification and you'll know that the podcast is out. But in any event, we put out an episode every Friday on all podcast platforms. And then we put out a video on YouTube on a weekly basis, which is usually on Wednesdays when we put the video out. But in any event, welcome to the People's Voice podcast. So today I want to talk about rent stabilization and rent control, and really just rent overall. And when I say rent, I'm talking about rent in terms of paying rent for housing, apartments, homes, depending on what the situation is for those who rent. And I want to talk about this because there was a huge case a case that was heading towards the Supreme Court level to be heard by the Supreme Court to discuss whether or not rent stabilization, rent control was constitutional in terms of from the landlord's perspective. There were a group of landlords who challenged rent control in New York, felt that it was not fair, and that case was heading towards the Supreme Court. There were apartment building owners and also a advocacy group for the building apartment owners in New York City who decided that they no longer thought it was fair to have rent stabilized apartments. And so they took to challenging this, even after losing in the city court and I believe state court as well, or county court and state court. They appealed those and almost got to the Supreme Court. But today I want to talk about rent stabilization. I'm going to talk about that case a little bit, and then we'll close out from there. So what is rent stabilization? Let me start there first, because I don't just assume everyone just automatically knows what rent stabilization is or rent control. So let me kind of give a definition of that first, and then we'll go from there. So rent control or rent stabilization, and I'm reading here a definition from the Bay Management Property Group. It says rent control or rent stabilization refers to government policies and regulations designed to limit the amount landlords can charge for rent. It says here, oftentimes these types of policies are put in place to address housing affordability concerns and prevent rent increases. Again, so that's the basic definition of rent control or rent stabilization. So with that definition now cemented, I'll now talk about the case in which occurred with these landlords, these building owners in New York City, from New York, that decided that they wanted to challenge previous judgments that had been placed against them, saying that they could not do away with rent stabilization, or they could not get the rent stabilization laws in the city removed, because those laws are put in place by the state or by the county, depending on which state you're in. But don't want to dwell too much into that. Anyway, so and I'm reading an article here from Reuters, and where they talked about this, and I just thought this was very interesting. So it says the U.S. Supreme Court turned away a bid by landlords to challenge rent stabilization laws in New York City that cap rents and make it harder to evict tenants. So it was a two-pronged argument. Not only did they want to do away with the rent stabilization laws in terms of having to stay at a certain rent for their properties, but they also wanted to, change some of the eviction laws. And those of you who rent, who are owners and rent, depending on which state you're in, how difficult it is to evict someone who is not paying rent. So, but those were the two arguments. It goes on to say here in the article that the Supreme Court justices, declined to hear any of the appeals by property owners or the industry groups, because, as I said before, they had some advocacy groups with them in this lawsuit. The justices declined to hear appeals by property owners and industry groups of lower court rulings that found the price and eviction controls did not violate what is known as the Takings Clause of the U.S. Constitution, Fifth Amendment, which bars the government from taking property without compensating owners. So, in a nutshell, the Supreme Court, they tried to take it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court judges said they're not even going to hear the case because there was not enough in their presentation or their defense to have to even consider looking at possibly overturning previous judgments or the laws in New York City. Now, interestingly enough, these laws are really not that old. Well, it depends on how old you are, right? But I'm reading this article from Reuters, and it says New York City's modern rent stabilization system enacted in 1969, and it was designed to address a shortage of affordable housing by capping rent increases and curbing the authority of property owners to evict tenants, which, it's very important information, because it, kind of fast forward now to 2024, rent, as you may have heard from many different reports and from people that are talking about this situation, rents have really skyrocketed in the last 3 years, definitely the last 2 years after the pandemic. Rents have just gone through the roof. And interestingly enough, these landlords or owners in New York are basically saying, look, we lost a ton of money during the pandemic because, for many who may not know, there was like a moratorium put on evictions and rent increases and things of that nature. Now that the economy has recovered somewhat, the owners here in New York City are like, well, we not only do we want to be able to, profit from our properties, but we want to be able to then dictate how much rent we can charge. And it sets this, it's a huge case in terms of here in the United States, because obviously if the justices had decided to hear this case, and if there was a decision made about rent stabilization in New York City, that would have had ripple effects and would have affected many many people across the country, because then you would have had other states who obviously would have referred, I should say, landlords or building owners or apartment building owners or property owners who rent. You would have had them then refer to the case in New York City had this been overturned, and you would have seen rent stabilization basically eliminated from from pretty much all of the states that still have them. Now, interestingly enough, there really are not a lot of states that have rent control. Again, I'm reading this article here from Bay Management Property Group, and in here they talk about which states have rent control, and it says rent control laws can vary from state to state, even within cities and municipalities. In addition, some states may have local jurisdiction with their own rent control regulations. But it says, however, not every state has strict laws regarding rent control. In fact, rent control is prohibited in 37 states. So in 37 states, basically landlord owners and building owners and apartment building owners and those who own properties for rent are not regulated or not restricted, I should say, under any type of rent stabilization or rent control laws. Currently, there's only 2 states that have statewide rent control regulations, and that's California and Oregon. However, other states, and I'm reading here this article again from Bay Management Group, it says, however, other states with county and city rent control laws include Maine, Maryland, Minnesota, New York, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C. Why am I talking about this, right? Because obviously this is information that you probably have heard or you can research yourself. Why am I talking about this? Well, I'm talking about this because, as I said, rent in the last couple of years has skyrocketed since the pandemic. Well, I'm reading the article here from NerdWallet, and it says, one of the first reasons why inflation, higher costs across the board, means landlords have to pass those costs on to renters. High rent costs contribute to inflation, and the cycle repeats. Lack of inventory, and this is something that I talked about on a previous podcast when I was talking about short-term rentals, Airbnbs, things of that nature, and the effect that it was having on the rental increases. Because, if a house is being rented or utilized for Airbnb, or a condo is being utilized for Airbnb, that's taking away inventory for long-term renting, and that also created some of the issues with the increase in rents. Again, I talked about the moratorium that was placed on rent increases and also evictions during the pandemic. And it says another reason for why the rents got so high, landlords were trying to make up for those pandemic era rent freezes and the discounts that they were giving to get people to move in. Then it goes on to say about shifting workforce, more demand to live alone. This was an interesting one when I read this. Prospective renters are increasingly looking for studio or one-bedroom apartments, driving up demand for available housing. And this is very much seen with the Gen Z generation, and even with a little bit with the later millennials, but really in that Gen Z demographic, they are not trying to do what previous generations did, where it was 2 and 3 to an apartment trying to live. They're looking for individual housing. There's more demand for that, and typically renters are much younger. I believe the percentage of renters under 35 is like 50% of renters. 50% of renters are 35 or younger, and then For homeowners, I think it's like 45% or higher are usually homeowners here in the United States. But going back, that's another reason why that drove up the rent increases. And then last but not least, barriers to home ownership, with the rising mortgage rates and also with the stringent credit requirements to get a mortgage, and then, the huge down payment, that's also contributed to increasing the rent. I'm talking about this specifically because rent affects the population that rental and rent increases and rent stabilization affects are those who are amongst the most vulnerable in terms of the population. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm pulling up some data here because I wanted to understand what does the rental landscape look like when you start talking about age, when you start talking about race, minorities. I wanted to understand what does that look like. So from Pew Research, they did a great breakdown of an article here where they kind of broke down the discrepancies in terms of renting and owning based on race. And I'm reading right here, one of the first things that kind of popped out to me in this article says one big disparity among renters is race and ethnicity. Nationwide, about 58% of households headed by Black or African American adults rent their homes, as do 52% of Hispanic or Latino-led homes. And again, this is according to a Pew Research analysis that was done. The reason I'm talking about the rent stabilization portion, the rent control that was recently struck down, is because this, in effect, basically is going to help to assist with allowing those who currently live under rent stabilization laws and regulations to continue to be able to afford the homes that they live in. Because if that decision had gone through, or I should say got heard by the Supreme Court and then ruled on in the favor of those landlords, you would have seen literally nationwide evictions and rent increases that would disproportionately affect the majority. The majority that would be affected are minorities and also those of very vulnerable populations. And so I'm glad to hear that was struck down, and there should be more legislation put forth to put rent stabilization into place in other states. I'm not against anybody making a profit, but I think there has to be some controls, because as we've seen here in the last, year and a half, 2 years, 3 years, these some of the rental rates that I've seen out there are astronomical, and it makes it very difficult for people just to sustain a home, an affordable home for themselves and for their families. So that is my time for today. Again, I hope this information was helpful and enlightening. If so, please feel free to leave a comment on the social media. You could reach me at the People's Voice Podcast. That's on Instagram, or you can reach me on any social media platform at I am Trey Evans, or you could just Google Trey Evans. Go ahead and tap in, and love to hear from you. So, as always, dreams are not just for sleeping. Please wake up and live your dreams. My name is Trey Evans, the People's Voice. Tell somebody about the dream. Salute.
tenants.